The United States Navy has 11 aircraft carrier strike groups. It controls more combined naval firepower than the next 13 navies on Earth combined. It has satellite systems that can track a single tanker across 6,000 miles of open ocean. And on May 3, 2026, a U.S. naval commander filed an internal report that was later leaked to 3 separate intelligence publications. The report did not describe victory. It described a problem that American military planners had privately called, and I am quoting directly, a threat architecture we do not have a clean answer for, not a manageable threat, not a contained threat, a threat architecture they do not have a clean answer for. Let that settle for a moment, because while Washington was telling the world that Iran was crumbling, that the blockade was working, that the storage tanks at Karg Island were days from overflowing, Iran was doing something in the Strait of Hormuz that the most sophisticated military on Earth had not fully anticipated. Not with aircraft carriers, not with ballistic missiles, with something far cheaper, far harder to stop, and far more permanent in its consequences. That is not a superpower managing a crisis. That is a superpower discovering that the rules of the game changed while it was still playing by the old ones. Welcome to Professor Merendí Updates. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give you the geopolitical, military, and economic analysis that mainstream coverage either cannot explain or chooses not to. No spin, no cheerleading, just the architecture of what is actually happening and why it matters to every nation on Earth. And what you are about to hear is the story of how Iran, a country being strangled by the most sophisticated naval blockade in modern history, is simultaneously turning the Strait of Hormuz into something the United States military has never encountered before. A trap that gets more dangerous the harder America pushes. Iran just activated its full layered mine warfare doctrine for the first time since 1988. U.S. minesweepers are operating in conditions they were not designed for. 3 carrier strike group commanders have reportedly requested tactical doctrine updates from the Pentagon. Lloyd's of London has now classified the entire Persian Gulf as a war risk zone for the first time in 38 years, and shipping insurance premiums have risen so sharply that several European energy companies are privately telling their governments the math no longer works. So make sure you are subscribed to Professor Merendí Updates right now, because this is the most forensic breakdown of what Iran has actually done to the Strait of Hormuz that you will find anywhere, and every single layer of this story is more consequential than the one before it. Let's begin where this story has to begin. The Strait of Hormuz, 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, just 34 kilometers, separating the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean beyond. Through that corridor, according to the International Energy Agency, approximately 20 million barrels of oil moved every single day before this conflict escalated. 20% of the entire world's seaborne oil supply. China receives approximately 1/3 of all its imported oil through it. Japan depends on it for roughly 85% of its crude imports. South Korea 80%, India nearly 1/3 of all its seaborne oil. European nations collectively receive 12 to 14% of their liquefied natural gas from Qatar through this single narrow passage, and the strait is not just wide, it is shaped like a bottleneck. The actual navigable shipping channel, the lane where oil tankers of significant draft can safely transit, is only about 3 kilometers wide in each direction. 3 kilometers! A supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is 450 meters long. You are moving vessels that are nearly half a kilometer in length through a channel barely 3 kilometers across in both directions simultaneously in waters that Iran has controlled the northern coastline of for the entire modern era. Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval forces have bases at Bandar Abbas, Keshm Island, Abu Musa Island, and the Greater and Lesser Tums, islands whose ownership has been disputed by the UAE since 1971, but which Iran has physically controlled and militarized for over 50 years. They are not watching the strait from a distance, they are inside it. And for decades, Western naval strategists understood this. The assessment was always the same. Iran could threaten the strait, harass shipping, raise costs, complicate transit, but close it completely, sustain a closure against a determined American naval response? No. That assessment was made in a world that did not include what Iran has spent the last 4 years quietly building. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. Iran did not wait. Within 72 hours, Iranian forces began executing what military analysts are now calling the most comprehensive denial of access operation ever attempted in the Persian Gulf. And the first thing they deployed was not a missile, it was a mine. According to reporting by Jane's Defense Weekly and confirmed by U.S. Fifth Fleet communications, intercepted and published by 3 separate intelligence-focused publications, Iranian naval forces began seeding the Strait of Hormuz with a combination of moored contact mines, bottom influence mines, and what experts identified as modified versions of the EM-52 rocket-propelled mine, a weapon that sits dormant on the seabed and launches an explosive rocket upward when a ship's acoustic signature matches its trigger parameters. These are not the sea mines of World War II. These are not simple devices a minesweeper can drag a cable through and detonate safely. The EM-52 variant and its Iranian-developed successors are what naval engineers call smart mines. They discriminate between targets. A fishing vessel passes over them, nothing happens. A military minesweeper passes over them, nothing happens, because the acoustic and magnetic signature doesn't match the target profile. A 150,000-ton crude oil tanker with a deep draft, a specific propeller signature, and a distinct magnetic anomaly passes over them and the mine launches. Captain James Holloway, a retired U.S. Navy mine warfare specialist, described it to the Naval Institute in terms that were unusually direct for a publication of that kind. He said, and I am quoting, "We have not faced a peer-level mine warfare threat in any operational theater since the Korean War. What Iran has deployed in the Strait represents a generational capability jump that our current minesweeping assets were simply not acquired to counter at this density and sophistication. Not at this density, not at this sophistication." This is not a retired officer being dramatic for an audience. This is a mine warfare specialist using the language of his technical field to say something specific. The United States Navy's minesweeping capability was not built for this. Here is how Iran's mine warfare strategy actually works, because understanding the mechanism is what makes the consequences legible. Iran did not simply dump mines randomly into the Strait. According to analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and corroborated by satellite imagery reviewed by several maritime intelligence firms, Iran executed a doctrine known as area denial layering. The outer layer, the approaches to the Strait from the Gulf of Oman, received a lower density of mines, primarily moored contact mines in deeper water. Their purpose is not to sink ships immediately. Their purpose is to force ships to slow down, call for escort, and wait. Waiting is expensive. Every day a supertanker sits offshore waiting for a cleared transit corridor costs its operator between $150,000 and $250,000 in charter fees, crew costs, and insurance premiums. And those insurance premiums have become their own weapon. Lloyd's of London's Joint War Committee designated the entire Persian Gulf a war risk zone on April 17, 2026. This was the first such designation for the full Persian Gulf since 1988, the tail end of the tanker war. The designation immediately triggered war risk surcharges on hull insurance for any vessel transiting the Gulf. Those surcharges, according to maritime broker Gallagher's published rate data, rose from a baseline of approximately 0.1% of vessel value per voyage to between 1.5% and 3.5% in the first weeks of April. For a supertanker worth $120 million, that is a single voyage insurance cost of up to $4,200,000 per voyage. In addition to the charter rate, in addition to the crew hazard pay supplements that unions in Greece, the Philippines, and South Korea began demanding and receiving. Shipping companies are not charities. Those costs flow directly into the price per barrel of every barrel of oil that successfully transits the Strait. But the inner layer of Iran's minefield, the actual navigable channel, is where the strategic genius becomes genuinely disturbing. The U.S. Navy's primary minesweeping assets in the Fifth Fleet area of operations are the Avenger-class mine countermeasures ships. There are currently 4 Avenger-class vessels assigned to the region. Each one can sweep approximately a 1-mile-wide corridor at a speed of roughly 5 to 8 knots using its mechanical and influence sweep systems. The navigable shipping channel in the Strait of Hormuz that must be kept clear for meaningful commercial traffic is approximately 6 kilometers wide and roughly 90 kilometers long through its most constricted and dangerous sections. Do the math. To sweep that corridor thoroughly enough to certify it safe for commercial transit in waters where Iran can reseed mines from fast boats operating at night from its own coastline just kilometers away, the U.S. Navy would need assets it does not have forward deployed in sufficient numbers, and Iran knows this. This is not a miscalculation on Tehran's part. This is a calculation that Iranian naval planners have been making for over a decade since they first acquired and then reverse engineered the EM-52 mine from Chinese technical specifications in the mid-2000s. The strategy has a name in Iranian military doctrine. It is called the mosquito strategy, applied to maritime denial, not winning a direct confrontation, but making the cost of the confrontation so continuously, unpredictably, and asymmetrically expensive that the opponent's domestic political support for the operation erodes faster than the opponent's military capability does. And here is where it starts to intersect with American domestic politics in ways that should genuinely concern every analyst watching this situation. Brent crude oil was trading at approximately $83 per barrel in January 2020. By April 21, 2026, it had traded above $127 per barrel, a 53% increase in under 4 months. The average price of retail gasoline in the United States crossed $4.30 per gallon in mid-April. In California, it crossed $5.90. These are numbers that American voters notice. These are numbers that American senators from oil-consuming states notice. And the political pressure those numbers generate does not fall on Tehran, it falls on Washington. But the mines are only the first layer, because Iran paired its mine-laying operation with something that naval analysts describe as the most operationally significant unmanned surface and subsurface vehicle deployment in the history of naval warfare. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has been developing and deploying what are formally classified as unmanned surface vehicles USVs for over 6 years. They have names like Martyr Abu Mahdi after the Iraqi militia commander killed alongside Qasem Soleimani in 20. They are fast. Some variants reach 60 knots faster than any U.S. Navy minesweeper and faster than most patrol craft. They are expendable, costing between $40,000 and $200,000 each, depending on payload and variant. And they are operating in the Strait of Hormuz in swarms. According to U.S. Fifth Fleet incident reports cited by Reuters and the war zone between March 15 and April 28, 2026, U.S. naval assets in the Strait recorded 73 separate USV approach instances where Iranian unmanned surface vehicles made aggressive approaches toward U.S. Navy ships or commercial vessels under U.S. escort. 73 incidents in 44 days, that is more than 1.5 incidents per day every day, without stopping. Each incident requires a response. A USS Gravely-class destroyer responding to an incoming USV swarm is expending between $500,000 and $2 million in naval gunfire, close-in weapon system rounds, and small boat interdiction resources per incident. Iran's cost to launch the USV, $40,000 to $200,000. America's cost to stop it, up to $2 million. This is what Iranian military planners mean when they describe asymmetric warfare. They are not trying to sink an American destroyer. They are trying to drain an American logistics budget, exhaust American crew rotations, and accumulate an economic and political cost that Washington's domestic audience eventually decides is no longer worth paying. Dr. Farzin Nadimi, an associate fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, put it in terms that are worth sitting with. He told Defense News, Iran does not need to win a single naval engagement to achieve its strategic objective in the Strait. It needs to make the Strait expensive enough, unpredictable enough, and politically toxic enough that the cost-benefit calculation in Washington shifts. That is an achievable goal, and they are pursuing it methodically. Achievable. That word deserves attention. If this breakdown is giving you context that you are not finding anywhere else, make sure you are subscribed to Professor Merendai updates and have your notifications turned on. We publish deep dive analysis on this conflict every single day. Hit subscribe right now so you do not miss a single update. This is a critical moment to pause, because what we have covered so far is the tactical picture. The mines, the drones, the insurance costs, the asymmetric economics, but there is a strategic layer underneath all of this that is far more consequential. And it involves a decision that was made not in Tehran, not in Washington, but in Beijing, a decision that changes the entire frame of what Iran is attempting, and why the United States may be discovering that its options are far more constrained than its public statements suggest. On April 9, 2026, a Chinese-flagged research vessel, the Haiyang DG-22, was photographed by commercial satellite imagery operating in the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Research vessels conduct oceanographic surveys. They measure water temperature, salinity, current speed, and most significantly, for naval purposes, acoustic properties. The acoustic properties of water at different depths determine how sound travels through it, which determines how difficult it is to detect submarines, which determines how effective anti-submarine warfare is in any given stretch of ocean. The Haiyang DG-22 was in those waters for 11 days. It was not the first time. According to records compiled by the maritime tracking platform Marine Traffic and analyzed by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, Chinese oceanographic vessels have conducted surveys in the eastern Gulf of Oman and Strait of Hormuz approaches on 6 separate occasions since 2021. China does not share that data with the United States Navy. Iran is a party to the 25-year cooperation agreement signed with China in 2021, an agreement that includes intelligence sharing provisions that have never been fully disclosed publicly. And Iran has operated Russian-supplied Kilo-class submarines from its fleet since the 1990s, submarines that become significantly more difficult to track and counter when someone has spent years mapping the precise acoustic conditions of the waters they patrol. The U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare advantage in the Persian Gulf region depends substantially on its acoustic intelligence, its knowledge of how sound behaves in these specific waters, at these specific depths, at these specific times of year. If that acoustic map has been updated and shared with Iranian naval planners through a Chinese intermediary, the U.S. Navy's submarine detection capability in the Strait degrades in ways that are not visible until the moment they matter. Rear Admiral John Kirby, speaking before he returned to government service, described the strategic logic in a 2023 paper for the Center for a New American Security. He said convergence of Chinese maritime intelligence collection with Iranian area denial capabilities in the Persian Gulf represents a force multiplication scenario that has not been adequately gamed in our public threat assessments. Not adequately gamed. This is what the leaked internal naval report, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, was describing. A threat architecture they do not have a clean answer for. Not because America lacks firepower, but because the intelligence foundation that American firepower depends on may have been systematically, quietly, and irrecoverably compromised. Let us now go inside Washington's own assessment apparatus, because the most extraordinary data point in this entire analysis is not what Iran is doing in the Strait. It is what American institutions are privately telling each other about it. On April 24, 2026, the Congressional Budget Office circulated a classified annex to its Emergency Supplemental Defense Appropriations Assessment. Portions of that annex were described without direct quotation by three separate congressional staffers speaking to Politico's National Security Desk on background. The annex did not describe a successful containment operation. It described what the staffers characterized as a sustained cost imposition scenario in which Iranian forces were achieving their primary operational objective, not defeating the U.S. Navy, but making continued operations in the Strait financially and politically unsustainable, over a medium-term timeline of 60 to 120 days. Three core findings emerged from that assessment. First, that current minesweeping assets in theater are insufficient to certify the primary shipping channel as safe for unescorted commercial transit. Second, that the cost of providing continuous naval escort for commercial vessels through the Strait, if extended beyond 90 days, would consume the entire Fifth Fleet's annual operational budget and require emergency supplemental funding. Third, that shipping companies representing approximately 40% of pre-conflict Strait transit volume had already privately indicated to the State Department that they would not resume unescorted transit even after a formal ceasefire until physical mine clearance was certified, a process that naval engineers estimated would take between 4 and 9 months. 4 to 9 months, not days, not weeks, months, during which the Strait would remain functionally impaired regardless of whether a ceasefire was signed. A congressional aide who described the annex to Politico used language that deserves to be read carefully. He said the overall assessment was that Iran had successfully converted the Strait of Hormuz from a temporary tactical threat into a persistent structural problem. Persistent, structural. These are not words that describe a crisis being won. The World Bank's October 2025 outlook had already projected that global growth would slow to 2.3% in 2026, the slowest rate since the COVID-19 recovery period. That projection was made before Brent crude crossed $120, before Lloyd's designated the Persian Gulf a war risk zone, before European shipping companies began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 12 to 14 days, and between $300,000 and $700,000 in additional fuel costs per voyage. The Cape of Good Hope routing is not a theoretical alternative. It is what ships are actually doing. Maersk, the world's second largest container shipping company, announced on April 19, 2026, that it was extending its Gulf of Oman transit suspension indefinitely for all vessels not contracted specifically for Gulf cargo. CMA-CGM, the third largest, followed 4 days later. The vessels that are still transiting the Strait are doing so under military escort, with war risk surcharges, with crews on hazard pay supplements, and with insurance policies that in some cases now cost more than the cargo being carried. In Germany, wholesale natural gas prices rose 41% between March 1st and April 25th. In Japan, the government activated its strategic petroleum reserve for the third time in its history. In India, which had been among the most enthusiastic buyers of discounted Iranian oil during the sanctions years, the government quietly requested emergency crude allocation talks with Saudi Arabia and the UAE after its Chabahar-linked supply chains became unreliable. On the streets of Tehran, a loaf of bread now costs 3 times what it cost in January 2025. On the streets of Rotterdam, heating oil has surpassed 2022 energy crisis peaks. On the streets of Houston, the political pressure from pump prices is generating congressional hearings, emergency SPR release debates, and an increasingly uncomfortable question that American legislators are beginning to ask loudly. How long? How long does this continue? And what does winning actually look like? 3 paths present themselves from this position. The first, Iran and the United States reach a negotiated framework. Iran accepts meaningful constraints on its nuclear program. The mine clearance process begins under international supervision. The blockade lifts. The strait reopens gradually over a period of months. Oil prices begin declining. Both sides claim some version of success. The problem, mine clearance certification, takes between 4 and 9 months by the Navy's own engineering estimates. The economic damage has already been done, and the precedent has been established that a country with Iran's resources can impose a multi-month impairment on the world's most critical energy choke point at a cost that is fundamentally asymmetric in Iran's favor. The second, the standoff continues. Iranian USV and mine operations persist. U.S. naval operational costs escalate toward the supplemental funding threshold. Domestic political pressure in the United States forces a partial drawdown of escort commitments. Shipping companies confirm their private assessment that unescorted transit is commercially unviable. The strait becomes functionally a restricted waterway, requiring advanced military coordination for all commercial transit, permanently changing the operational framework of global energy trade. The third, the United States escalates to direct strikes on Iranian naval infrastructure. Bandar Abbas, Keshm Island, the IRGC Navy fastboat bases, the mine-laying facilities. This option carries the lowest risk of the sustained cost imposition scenario. It also carries the highest risk of regional escalation involving Hezbollah, Houthi forces, Iranian missile strikes on Gulf state energy infrastructure, and the possibility of Chinese diplomatic intervention that reshapes the entire strategic environment. What we can say with confidence is this: Iran is not losing the Strait of Hormuz battle the way Washington's public messaging suggests. It is conducting it exactly as its doctrine prescribed, asymmetrically, sustainably, and with a cost calculus that runs in its favor. For every week the current conditions persist. The fortress may be crumbling economically, but it built one genuine, functional, thoroughly engineered trap on its way down, and the United States Navy is standing at the entrance to that trap, calculating the cost of going through it. The story of the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026 is ultimately about what happens when asymmetric doctrine meets a military establishment that prepared for the last war. America built aircraft carriers, Iran built mines that cost $40,000 and disable ships worth $400 million. America built destroyers, Iran built drone swarms. It can launch faster than America can intercept. America built sanctions, Iran built a 44-year institutional memory of surviving them, and then built the doctrine to turn its own vulnerability into an offensive weapon. Military superiority is only as decisive as the assumptions underneath it remain valid. When those assumptions shift, when Lloyd's reclassifies the Gulf, when Maersk reroutes to the Cape, when CMA-CGM follows, when a congressional annex describes a persistent structural problem, when the Navy's own mine warfare specialists use the phrase generational capability gap, when shipping companies say 4 to 9 months regardless of the ceasefire, the mythology of overwhelming dominance does not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It turns off the lights, one shipping lane at a time, one insurance premium at a time, one congressional hearing at a time, one leaked internal report at a time, until one morning a U.S. naval commander files a report that uses the phrase a threat architecture we do not have a clean answer for. And the question is no longer whether America can win this confrontation. The question is what winning costs, and whether the domestic audience in whose name the war is being fought is willing to pay it. Subscribe to Professor مرندي updates right now if you want to be part of this conversation as it develops, and I want to hear from you directly in the comments. Here is the question: do you believe the United States has a viable military answer to Iran's mine warfare strategy in the Strait, or has Iran successfully converted the world's most critical energy choke point into a persistent strategic liability that no amount of American firepower can quickly resolve? Drop your analysis below. Because the most important conversations happening about this crisis are not in Washington briefing rooms. They are in comment sections like this one, where people who actually think are asking the questions that the official narrative refuses to answer